You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 38. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today, we're starting a new series where we're examining the history of pseudo-archaeology. Today we'll be discussing hyperdiffusionism and where it came from and how it's developed into the theory that it is today. Get ready to think critically.
Funny bitty blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Everyone, welcome to the show. Hey, Ken, how's the weather?
It is beautiful, sunny. It's starting to be like almost summer here in southern New England. So that's a good thing. No more frost, no more snow.
You know, actually, it's funny you mentioned summer because it's been like dark as fuck here, but I have been told that the summers in Virginia are hellish, and I know that they are because I've worked in them. So I'm kind of enjoying the fact that it's still cold here for right now. But anyway.
Yeah, we had a stretch of around 10 days where nobody saw the sun, where us old guys started reminiscing about the sky being blue at one time, and the kids didn't believe us, but you know.
I was going to say, what is this blue you speak of?
What?
I've been told that there's something behind the clouds, but I don't believe anyone anymore.
Yeah. It was like Seattle, but without really good coffee for 10 days.
Okay, so today, Ken, I wanted to launch a new series, and I thought this would be the right show to do this. I thought it would be interesting if we talked about the history of pseudo-archaeology, pseudoscience-ish, and alt history.
Yeah.
And what I mean when I say talking about the history of it is looking at how it developed and looking at some of the big names who helped push it along.
Yeah. And that kind of, when you started talking about that brought to mind the following. And it's going to be all over the place a little bit, and it also brings in something that's happening virtually right now in the media circus involving archaeology. And I think
are you saying you're going to have a disjointed rant? Because we never have those on this show.
That's my middle name, Sarah. It's Kenny, just disjointed rant Fader.
It's a hell of a name, man.
Hey, listen, whatever works. The initials. I have a card. It's on my business card. It's
I'm so making you a business card that says that.
You oughta. So here's what I thought of when you started talking about this. And I'll start even before the beginning, and then I'll work my way into it. Okay. Which is, you, Sarah, are a trained archaeologist, a rational person, a scientist, as am I. And you and I probably have this, what for some people is a misconception, that experience, training, and are meaningful, are good things when we're talking about any scientific enterprise. That it's good to know something, it's good to have training in that thing, it's good to have experience in that thing, and that seems sort of self-evident that if you want to get your car fixed, you go someplace where people have experience at fixing cars, have training in fixing cars, and can work on your car. And if you have a medical issue and there's something bothering you, maybe you're getting blinding headaches or you can't sleep, you want to go to somebody who's got experience and training and a background in that expertise in that field. But and this really is going to lead to what we're talking about for the rest of the show, is that there's a conceit on the part of a lot of people that we have it exactly wrong. That in fact, experience, training, and expertise is a straitjacket. That we are so locked in to what we've been taught and what we've been inculcated with, and that we can't think outside of the box. Cremo and Thompson, these authors who wrote this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which effectively is like Hindu creationism, that the world is 300 billion years old and human beings have been around for the entire time. And very, very strange book. They use the phrase knowledge filter. So they accuse people like you and me and other people who listen to this podcast and Jeb and skeptics, scientific archaeologists. We have a filter and we don't allow anything that doesn't match or fit our preconceived notions about the past. Anything that doesn't fit through that filter, we discard it, we throw it away. And as a result, in this mindset, you and me are incapable of changing our minds, of recognizing new and interesting data when it's out there. And so, in fact, in this kind of bizarro, topsy-turvy world, having experience in archaeology, having expertise in archaeology, having training in archaeology is a bad thing. And that, in fact, it's much better if you have no background in it whatsoever, because you're much more open to new thoughts and new ideas. And this has led to, I guess you would call it a meme. And here's the story is, because we are so restricted, so close-minded, so petrified in our thinking, that what's really cool is that somebody comes along who is not a pointy-headed intellectual like us, not an ivory tower, not a resident of the ivory tower. And
I got elevated.
Yeah, there you go. And these complete innocents come along at the emperor's got no clothes. They come up with amazing new discoveries, and people applaud that and think, isn't that cool? Isn't that payback to those smart ass PhDs, those smart ass scientists, those smart ass archaeologists? And I'm coming back around to archaeology, but let me digress a little bit. This happens in every science, and it happens in medical science as well. And I remember a few years ago, there was a movie called Lorenzo's Oil.
Yes.
It's a perfect example of this meme. So here, this is a true story. It's a very sad story, and this is not in any way me trying to diss the parents of this child who was born perfectly normal for the first 5 years of his life, and then started, acting strangely, having headaches. He couldn't walk, and they went from doctor to doctor to doctor. This is the kind of cliche version of the story. Went from doctor to doctor to doctor. People said, "Oh, it's just all in his head. Maybe he was exposed to some tropical virus." Until the doctor said, "No, he's got this genetic condition that prevents his body from adequately metabolizing fats, and there's no cure. There's no good end here. He's going to die in a couple of years." The parents, not medical, no training in medicine, not doctors, not scientists, decided they were going to, by the force of their love, they were going to cure their son. And in the movie, they experiment. They read every medical journal, even though they have no background in medicine. They come up with this mixture of various oils that you can buy off the shelf at the supermarket. They started feeding these oils to their kid, and eureka! All those scientists who said he was going to die.
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so he can't process fats, right?
Something that's apparently, or cannot process these fats in the way that regular people can, people who don't have the genetic defect.
So how does feeding him a bunch of oils, which are basically fats, how does that solve the problem?
I play a doctor on TV, but I'm not actually a doctor, so I'm not exactly sure.
Man, this is going to bug me now, but go ahead.
But we'll look it up. The story then is that miraculously this kid gets better. He doesn't die. They've saved their son. They start sharing this with other people. And it's this wonderful meme. The doctors, all these guys with degrees from Ivy League institutions, they think they're smarter than everybody else. They think they know what they're doing. But it's a couple trying to save their kid are actually able to cure him. The only problem is a lot of that story is exaggeration and, in fact, not true. Right. In fact, this poor little boy, Lorenzo, they call it Lorenzo's Oil, it's the name of their kid. It ends up that this little kid, the disease progressed. He didn't get better. He just didn't die. In fact, the doctor said, he was about 5 years old. The doctor said, usually this resolves itself in a couple of years. He's going to die. He lived to be 30, Sarah. So he far outlived what the doctors predicted. However, for the vast majority of those 30 years, he was blind.
Oh,
he
no.
was in a wheelchair. And from what I could tell, although the parents disputed this, he was in a prolonged vegetative state. So while he was physically alive, it was, even his father, I believe, has in recent years, kid died several years ago, said, I'm not sure we did the right thing. If the oil kept him alive, he didn't have much quality of life. And the thing is, again, contrary to the meme, when doctors saw that he wasn't dying, they did a number of tests on this. What they found out was that this Lorenzo's oil does nothing whatsoever for kids. Once they start to manifest their symptoms, they get the disease and they die. They have no idea why this kid, Lorenzo, lived to be 30, but they're not even convinced that it was the oil, that it was one of those situations in which, sometimes doctors think they know when somebody's end is going to come, and that for whatever reason, the person continues to live. And in re-examining this Lorenzo's oil, they ended up finding that if you do the genetic test and before your kid, it's always boys. We start this before they start to manifest the genetic defect is on the X chromosome, but it does not affect girls. Anyway,
that broken chromosome y'all have.
Yeah, and so I guess what happens is that they've done a number of studies. The number of people with this disease is very small, and when half of the little boys they gave the oil to before they manifested the symptoms, they say genetically, okay, this kid's got it. Half of them actually do get better, and they don't know exactly why. And half of them, the disease just progresses, and they go downhill rapidly, and they die. So the thing is, it's a really interesting story, but it doesn't really fit the meme of evil scientists, bad scientists, closed-minded scientists, and it's, wow, some guy working in his kitchen solves this horrible disease. Right. Now, the meme is being repeated now in obviously not nearly as horrible a way. If you've been watching the various news accounts online, here's how the meme goes now. 15-year-old high school student rewrites Maya. Here's the story of the Maya.
And I was wondering where you were going with this.
Yeah, and here's the deal. So this kid, I'm sure he's a really bright kid, wonderful kid, is doing like a science project, and he's really interested in the Maya, and he starts, mapping out the Maya sites, and now he's got no background in archaeology, obviously. He's a high school kid, and suddenly, again, following the meme, this little kid working on his little laptop in his little house has a eureka moment that trained scientists could never have because they're so close-minded, sees that the locations of Maya cities match what this kid is calling Maya constellations. So in other words, we can explain the location of Maya cities on the basis of these constellations. And not only that, but next, that's number one. Number two, because he knows what these constellations look like, he can predict the location of as yet undiscovered Maya cities. And number three, it seems that he can apply the same technique to sites in like Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. And so, oh my God, here is this 15-year-old kid out of nowhere, because he's not restricted, because he's not straitjacketed by training. He sees a pattern that nobody else can see, that all over the world, ancient civilizations built their cities to match the constellations in the sky. The only problem with that meme is, as well-meaning as this kid is, Mayanists have come out and to a person have said, sorry, this is bullshit. Because effectively, there are so many Maya sites that if you cherry pick the right ones, they can look like constellations, or they can look like the locations of subway stops in Manhattan, or they can look like the locations of Dunkin' Donuts in your city. You can make it look like anything because there are so many of them. And then they said, well, by the way, this place where the kid said, there's got to be a Maya site there because it fits my pattern. And then they went and looked on like Google Earth and found something strange in the jungle. Oh my God. They made And what the Mayanists have said, well, actually, that's a recently cleared field, and it's not a Maya site at all. And the fact that the notion that, well, wait a minute, and we can all, so that all these other civilizations did exactly the same thing. It didn't smell right to me from the very beginning. And in fact, the Mayanists have come out and say, look, cute kid, really interesting that he's, great that he's interested in this, but this discovery that he made, this meme that all these trained archaeologists can't see what a 15-year-old working in his parents' basement was able to find. That meme turns out, in fact, not to apply. And so what we're going back to is, in so many cases, the things that we have already talked about on this podcast, and the new theme that you've got, looking at the history of pseudo-archaeology, fringe archaeology, alternative archaeology, it's that in spades. It's Barry Fell. Well, okay, he's not a. You know why he could discover stuff that us trained archaeologists couldn't? Because he wasn't polluted by what we know. He's a marine biologist. How about Eric von Daniken? How could he find all this stuff that we've never seen, that we've never accepted? Well, because his mind is not warped by training, experience, right? Or training or experience or expertise. What his background is, he was like an assistant hotel manager. And how about Giorgio Tsoukalos? Look at this stuff. He can see this. And you and I, Sarah, and the rest of the trained archaeological community, we miss this. We're too blind to this. Why? Because Giorgio's background is, what was sports marketing or something?
It was a sports announcer.
Yeah, something like that. And Graham Hancock, what's his background? Well, he was a journalist. The thing is, we go on and on and on, list every one of these, and it's the same idea. It's that we, because we have training, because we are steeped in archaeological training and experience, because that's where we come from, that we are limited. There's a box around our brains, and we can't see outside of that box. And it takes somebody without any of those skills to see the truth. And it really is a kind of a bizarro, strange world in which that people consider us to be at a disadvantage because we know something. How weird is that, Sarah?
I've never really understood that phenomenon myself, but like you said, I've gone through college and I've been trained, and even when I was young, I understood that you can't do something unless you know at least a little bit about it, which is the fatal flaw of this whole argument from their side. This whole, not being a trained archaeologist makes you a better archaeologist, because even the ones who are doing the most bizarre archaeology are still pantomiming what they think is archaeology. So they're still at some level trying to reproduce academic procedures, which I see that as kind of a little hypocritical, maybe. Just because, they're like, oh, I'm not a trained archaeologist. And it's like, yeah, but you think you're doing archaeology. So where did you learn to do this thing that you think you're doing? You're not doing it right, but you think you are. Yeah. So where did you learn that?
They inhabit an alternative universe of, okay, we know they go out and dig holes. We're going to go out and dig holes.
Right.
Only we're not going to be restricted in our interpretation.
It's cult science is what it is. It's cult science.
Right, yeah.
That's literally what it is.
They'll send samples out for radiocarbon dating, but because they have no experience with that, they don't know that, you know what, stratigraphy is really important and association is really important. And you can date a piece of charcoal. That's the easy part. The hard part is making sure that it's associated with the site that you really want to date. You don't want to date the charcoal. I don't give a shit how old charcoal is. I want to know when was the site occupied. And therefore, when I date the charcoal, I want to make damn sure that charcoal is the same age of the site.
Well, yeah,
again,
exactly.
Without any experience in doing that, with just kind of a superficial understanding of, archaeologists, they dig up charcoal, they send it to a lab and pay them, and a number comes back.
Yeah.
Without understanding how to interpret that number and how confident you should be in that number. Sure, you can decide that, you know what, American Stone Age Mystery Hill is way too old to be a colonial site because at some point somebody found a piece of charcoal there, they got a radiocarbon date, but there's no training, no experience in keeping stratigraphic profiles intact and preventing contamination, so that ultimately, you're right, they pantomime the process. But again, you and I would look at that date and say, well, it doesn't really match our expectation, so we better look at it a little more carefully. They consider that to be our denial of anything that fits outside of that box we're in, where they're not looking at that at all. They are completely credulous about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to go to break real quick. And when we get back, we are going to have a really brief history lesson and then probably rant some more.
There you go.
Professional Certifications for Scientists, or PCS, aims to provide practical educational videos, field guides, knowledge tests, professional certifications, and employment connections to professional scientists everywhere. Check out the videos page for high-quality training videos on a variety of topics. Find PCS videos at www.pcscourses.com/videos. PCS, a place for good scientists to become great science professionals.
And we're back. Ken, have you calmed down some?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's just, you know what happens, Sarah, is that I get up in the morning and I've got my Yahoo page, and I've got the science feeds. So it's all this cool science stuff.
I love that you still use Yahoo.
I do. I love the Yahoo. And I guess, I don't do the Facebooks, so I got my Yahoo feed. But I got all this science. I got Scientific American and a bunch of other stuff. And you open up and the first thing you see is high school student is going to cause the Zionists to rewrite history, and you go, oh shit. And I'm skeptical, but I said, okay, let me take a look at this. And I'm reading it and saying, did any of the people writing this stuff have any background in science at all? Because there's complete, it's this embrace. It's this wonderful fairy story of the little guy in his garage builds the perpetual motion machine, and the scientists all look, the stiff-necked.
Oh, you mean you haven't built your perpetual motion machine yet?
I'm working on
directions off the internet.
I'm working on it. But but my time machine has been taking up all of my energy. So the perpetual motion machine, that ain't working yet for me. But I'm working on it. But yeah, I mean, it's just it's disconcerting, it's enervating, it's disappointing that even in ostensibly science-based news, we're not talking about ancient aliens, we're not talking about really fringe stuff, but even there's a lack of kind of reflection about, well, what does this mean? Should we not talk to people who are actual experts in the field before we go off half-cocked and say, oh my God, this is going to change everything?
Well, I think some of this going over the history of this whole concept that we call currently pseudo-archaeology will kind of shed some light on why people think that way.
Right.
Mainly because one of the things to keep in mind as we're going over the audience to keep in mind as we're going over all of this is at some point archaeology and history and that kind of stuff wasn't really a field. It was a thing that rich people and priests and people who had nothing else to do did.
Right.
And so it's really interesting. So we're going to focus mostly on alternative history. And once we get through that, I want to talk about the ancient aliens people and hyperdiffusionism through aliens.
Sure.
But
you're absolutely right. Absolutely right, Sarah, that for a very long time, archaeology didn't become professionalized until the 20th century. So you got a lot of guys out there saying, you know what, I'm going to dig shit up. And they did. Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who was like the first Egyptologist, his job before that, he was a circus strongman.
Yep.
And went to Egypt and said, yeah, I'm going to dig a bunch of stuff up. And the perception was, that's what archaeology is. You go, you dig a bunch of stuff up, and then you bring it home to a museum.
I think my favorite Giovanni story, though, isn't even a him digging things. I guess it's terrifying to think of today, but it's kind of comical for the era. He was investigating, quote unquote, a mummy tomb and wasn't paying attention to where he was stepping and apparently fell through a floor into a mummy's crypt.
Oh my God.
And in a moment of, I guess, panic, he's rolling around and thrashing and just decimating this mummy that he landed on because he couldn't get out of the tomb fast enough.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure is very disconcerting.
Yeah, I think somewhere his I have it here somewhere, his memoirs, and he actually talks about at one point climbing up a hill it was nothing but dead bodies. It was mummies, and the heads would would break off the bodies and roll back down the hill as he's walking through them. But he didn't want to bring mummies back home.
No, they weren't into mummies yet.
It was gold and lapis lazuli and these beautiful artifacts. That's what was going to earn him some money. But as people back in Europe, they thought, well, that's an archaeologist. That's what archaeologists do.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people modern day still think that. I call it artifact porn. They think that's all it is just the fetishizing of the object itself. Yes. But
it's a big Easter egg hunt that we do. That's all
exactly.
It is. It's an Easter egg hunt. Absolutely.
But this whole interest in history and where we came from, we being the human species and all that, I mean, that's an age-old question.
Sure.
And this whole concept of where did culture start and where did culture come from, which is a major focus of most archaeology and anthropology. Not where did the culture come from, but what is the culture of the people that I'm looking at. But so have we discussed the term hyperdiffusionism in detail yet?
We probably have danced around it, but why don't you provide like a definition that everybody can kind of get their minds around.
Okay, so now I'm on the hot seat. So
yeah, you notice how I did that, Sarah?
Yeah,
cool.
You sidestepped that quite well.
I tell you what. Before you do that, let's back up. The concept of diffusionism is the whole idea that ideas do travel, and there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, this happens. Ideas travel from people to people, so that people in one river valley may develop a particular agricultural technique, or they may develop a metallurgical technique or a ceramic or whatever, and that because of trade, because of contact, war, whatever, people in adjacent valleys see this and go, we'd like to do that too. And so they borrow those ideas, and ideas do spread across, like ripples across a pond. Here in Connecticut, the oldest ceramics that we find here, probably less than around 3,000 years old. And we don't see any developmental sequence. We just see, bam, this ceramic type called Vinette 1 shows up in Connecticut 3,000 years ago. And when we look to the west and the south, we see the same kind of ceramics, only it's a little bit older. And so we know, they didn't invent ceramic technology in Connecticut. It diffused, it moved in from the west and the south.
And that's an excellent example.
Yeah, and corn agriculture. That was developed in Mesoamerica. We know teosinte is the wild ancestor of corn. It doesn't grow in North America. Teosinte does. Teosinte was domesticated by people, and it spread from there. And we find that's 5 or 6 or 7 or even 8,000 years ago, south of the border in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, and then we start seeing it show up in the American Southwest around 4,000 years ago, and the American Southeast around 3,000 or 3,500 years ago. So it's pretty, and there's no developmental sequences. We see that stuff, bam, it shows up. It diffused from the south. That happens.
Now, hyperdiffusionism is taking the concept of diffusionism to, I want to say, the crazy level. Which I don't think is entirely fair, but that's how I feel about it. Hyperdiffusionism is almost always used by the fringe, and it's always used in the context of there was a great civilization X, and said civilization X created all culture, all art, all technology, all everything, and then those people went out and taught that culture to everyone else in the world.
Yeah, you got it.
That's hyperdiffusionism, and that falls squarely into the realm of the fringe, and that is kind of what we're going to be talking about today, and maybe a little bit in another show later on. Because the concept of hyperdiffusionism has actually been around since like the early 1800s, if not a little bit earlier. Originally, it was thought that because there always for hyperdiffusionism to work, you have to have a mother culture. Basically, you have to have a culture that has all this stuff. And originally, because of religion was so big in society, back in the day, they always thought that it was the Garden of Eden or the cradle of humanity, which floated around depending on who was talking about it. It's been everywhere from Bolivia to Argentina, I think. So Argentina. So the nobody really ever can decide where this mother culture starts, but it starts and then it starts to spread. And for a long time, it was actually an accepted theory because, in the early 1800s, we didn't have science like we have today. So there wasn't a lot of checks and balances here. And also we didn't have as much information as we have today. We have a lot of information now because we've had the academic field of history, the academic field of archaeology, the academic field of anthropology, and all of those other related fields. We've had those for so long now. A lot of people don't even understand what it would be like to not have these developed fields of science. Yeah.
I mean, the notion of kind of hyperdiffusionism, you're right. It was not always on the fringe. The British school of diffusionism, that was like an actual paradigm. That was a kind of a truth held by a lot of British anthropologists. Yeah. That, you know what? Essentially, to look at it from even the other perspective, Sarah, it's basically the assumption is that most human groups, most people, most cultures are dull and uninventive and would never progress. And it took a genius culture, some culture that had, for whatever reason, this ability to progress. It happened there, the mother culture, as you said, and everything spread out from there. And essentially, the British school, their argument, they took it for granted that there was a mother culture. They didn't know where it was, and that what they sometimes also tried to do is discern, well, what made them? Why were they the mother culture? And the school of environmental determinism was that in one part of the world, the environment was so salubrious, so powerful, so rich that those people were able to progress, to advance tremendously, and they then spread their cultural advances to the rest of the world. But there also were, effectively, some of these guys were racists who said, yeah, well, of course, the native people of the New World, they're not bright enough to figure out agriculture or metallurgy or to build monumental architectural works by themselves, so they must have been inspired from somewhere else. And the dark-skinned people of Africa, the people of Asia. So therefore, and for a lot of the folks in the British school, it was Egypt. Egypt was the source, the core, the mother culture. And they couldn't deny that. And that's ancient. And man, they were really advanced. So they were presented as the mother culture. Of course, all that fell apart when they started dating the stuff in Mesopotamia and found out, oops, that's older than Egypt. So Egypt can't be the mother culture. Well, maybe it's Mesopotamia, and that's where the Garden of Eden was. So that makes sense. But it was pretty explicit, even among these guys, when they found writing, when they found mathematics, when they found sophisticated calendars, when they found monumental architectural works, when they found sophisticated agricultural techniques, when they found metallurgy. Well, that's all advanced stuff. It must have come from somewhere other than the New World. Other than Mexico, other than Peru.
And it was very easy to kind of try to pin that on Mesopotamia and Egypt because at the time there was far more archaeology. Because remember, the 1800s is mid 1800s is about where archaeology starts to coalesce and starts to kind of sort of start resembling a scientific field of study.
Right. Yeah.
Now that's not saying there weren't things that we would recognize as archaeology occurring before this point. I believe there was there was actually a woman who was doing archaeological digs in the late 1700s. So, this goes back pretty far.
Yeah, you got Thomas Jefferson is excavating mounds on his property back in the 18th century as well.
You're right. Right.
So it happened. It did occur that people with no training, but also with few, if any, preconceptions.
It's unfair to say that though, because there was no one to train you. There was no way to be trained.
Yeah, no, that was not. I was not criticizing those folks. I'm saying there were people who had no training, but also didn't go out there with preconceptions about what they would find, but went out there and said, you know what? And the interesting thing was, these were some of the first people who recognized maybe we can answer questions by digging in the dirt.
Right.
Maybe we can answer questions, even though these people are long gone and left no written record, the physical record can inform us about their lives. And that's cool. That's real archaeology. If Belzoni wasn't doing real archaeology, he was looking for artifacts that would make him rich by selling them on the antiquities market.
Well, and I mean, if you want to really go back to the very first of it, I mean, the first recorded quote unquote archaeological excavation that we are aware of actually happened in ancient Egypt, and it occurred around the Sphinx. I forget the guy's name, and I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway, but he was an advisor to the pharaoh at the time, and the Sphinx had been there long enough that people had forgotten who built it. So he sent his little advisor out with a bunch of workers, and they unburied the Sphinx. And then, I don't know, they found out whatever they needed to find out. And the reason we know this occurred is because the guy who led the expedition chiseled out his name in a stone plaque and reburied it when they reburied the Sphinx. Yeah. So we've been interested as a species in digging things up and trying to figure out what they are for a very long time. Yeah. But it didn't start to.
Yeah. I'm just saying your story of Egypt, this something similar happened in Mesopotamia as well, where this Mesopotamian, the head of a city-state, his name is Nabonidus, his army discovered the ruins of the ancient city of Larsa, and they dug it up. Yeah. They were interested in what they could find there. And there actually is a cuneiform tablet somewhere that's been translated. It talks about it was, a place built by the gods. It was long covered up, but now it's been revealed, and it's amazing. And you're looking at something that's 3,000, 3,500 years ago. It's a very long time ago. So that's very, very cool.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to break real quick. And when we get back, I want to talk about Ignatius Donnelly.
Absolutely.
Women in Archaeology is a show about archaeology by the women of archaeology. An alternating panel of women archaeologists discuss the issues in archaeology that impact professionals and the public every day. Check out Women in Archaeology for a different perspective on the past today at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/WIA. Now let's get back to the show.
And we're back. And I want to talk about Ignatius Donnelly because Ignatius Donnelly was probably one of the first true hyperdiffusionists. At least the first one we have on record that I can find.
Well, I don't know if he gets primacy there, but he certainly was a badass diffusionist. And but you make a really good, it's a point that we have made kind of tangentially before, that with hyperdiffusionism, there are lots of different varieties. There are the ones that simply say, well, people are stupid, so they must have gotten an idea from somewhere else. And very often they're racist, and very often they're kind of silly. But at least some hyperdiffusionists point to a real place and say, well, it all started in Egypt. It all started in Mesopotamia. Right. But with Ignatius Donnelly, and then later on with Eric von Däniken and Giorgio Tsoukalos and all the ancient astronauts and ancient aliens guys, those guys are hyperdiffusionists. And where in the past the hyperdiffusionists pointed to Egypt and said it all came from there, and some of them pointed to Mesopotamia and said it all came from there. Donnelly pointed to a blank spot on a map in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and said, oh no, it all started there. And Von Daniken and Tsoukalos point their finger, not their middle finger, their pointer finger, up to the heavens, up to the sky, and say, no, it all came from there.
Now we'll get to the ancient aliens people in another show,
right.
but
Sure.
this one
yeah.
this time I just want to focus on people who are making claims about hyperdiffusionism here on Earth.
Yes.
I just want to keep it a little closer to home this time.
But that's fine. But it's all for context. It's all part of the same fabric. It's woven from the same cloth.
And I'm sure that our listeners have probably heard us talk about Ignatius Donnelly before. In 1882,
Atlantis, right?
Yeah, in 1882, Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which, as far as we can tell, is the launching point for all of the weird Atlantis is real crap. Because up to this point, the only written mentions of Atlantis is in Plato's Timaeus and Critias.
It's Timaeus and Critias.
Thank you.
Yeah,
right.
You bet.
And and neither of them really spend a whole lot of time talking about it. And also, the Atlanteans were the bad guys. So where this whole concept of like erudite beings coming down and being nice to everybody, that I think all came out of Donnelly. Donnelly, however, is the first person to say that, yes, Atlantis was real. It was a real place. And it is where all of these really, really smart people, this genius mother culture lived. And when Atlantis was destroyed, because he believes that it did happen, all of the survivors from Atlantis went out into the world and took all the culture with them. And that's why we have these advanced civilizations at these ancient points in history, is because they all got influenced by the great Atlanteans.
Right. And but again, exactly as we've been talking about, the fundamental theme, the fundamental assumption is the people of the world needed what effectively was a Peace Corps to bring them up from their benighted ignorance and poverty and primitiveness, and they needed a mother culture, a superior culture that had worked it all out, metallurgy and the architecture and engineering and math and all that stuff. They had already worked it out, and they're the ones who introduced it or shared it with the rest of the world.
And to keep with another theme that we've been on about for several episodes now, actually, Donnelly believed that Atlantis was the original home of the Aryan race, and the Aryan race were described as being red-haired, blue-eyed, and he believed that the pure-blood descendants of these Aryan race would be found in Ireland, because that's where redheads occur naturally, apparently.
Oh, there you go.
So it is in keeping with that whole... I have a hard time calling it racism at this point in history, just because it was like everybody was like this, but it was racism. So, it is what it is. It's not racism how we recognize it today, but it was racism.
It's like the ancient aliens meme. I'm not saying it was racism, but
it was racism.
Well, but fundamentally, that's the thing that the hyperdiffusionists are kind of slippery about it, because depending on which hyperdiffusionist you talk to, it's the racism is directed at different people.
Right.
So that, you on the one hand, you have folks who are saying, no, this African civilization, Egypt, they're the source of everything. And they are, after all, Africans, for God's sake, and they're not white people. But then you have people reacting to that going, no, the Egyptians, they learned it from these red-haired guys who are living on the lost continent of Atlantis.
And sometimes you'll see the Egyptian culture, the Egyptian civilization being considered the mother culture, but the rulers of said mother culture weren't actually Africans. You'll see that sometimes, and I think we'll actually hit on that in some of the names we're going to go over.
Right.
Somebody I do want to mention before we move on is William Fairfield Warren, who in 1885 threw a ratchet into this. Now, he still believed in the Aryan race, but he believed that the mother culture actually came out of the Garden of Eden, which was located underneath all of the ice in the North Pole. He also believed that that's where Atlantis was. You'll see Atlantis pop up in a lot of these.
Oh, my God, yeah.
But he believed that Atlantis was also the Garden of Eden, was also Mount Meru, which was also Avalon, which was also any other lost civilization that was supposed to be awesome, was and is, well, I mean, if he was still alive, he would argue that it is still under all of the ice in the North Pole, which if we keep up with global warming, we'll find out soon enough. So
Oh, yes. But that's interesting that he says the North Pole, but the folks who support the pole shift hypothesis, they've got Atlantis under the South Pole.
right.
They're hedging their bets, Sarah. Wherever
Yeah.
you look,
This is
you're gonna-
true.
And I do that actually in the Frogs book, is I have a map with little dots showing
Yes.
where a series of authors have claimed Atlantis to be. And I live in this little piddly-ass little town up in northwestern Connecticut, little Riverton, population of about 300 people. This may be the only place on Earth where somebody hasn't said, I think that's where Atlantis was. So we've avoided
jest.
that. Yeah,
You
no
jest,
kidding.
but later on we talk about a guy who seems to think Atlantis was in California.
Well, that makes sense. But ultimately, understand that, so Ignatius Donnelly, and here again with the whole Atlantis thing, after Timaeus and Critias, most Greek scholars said, nah, there's nothing to it. There
Right.
always was an undercurrent of people who read those dialogues and said, yeah, there must be something to this. It's
Right.
Donnelly who really makes it, who succeeds in making it very popular. He was at the right time at the right place. People were looking for the mother culture, and here was a ready-made example of that. And Donnelly, in the Antediluvian World, in that book, he goes through a series of great leaps forward in antiquity, and every one of them he ascribes to Atlantis. So.
Right.
Pyramids, that was Atlantis. Agriculture, that was Atlantis. The development of the arch, that was Atlantis. And essentially what Donnelly does is, if you are this hyperdiffusionist, and if you truly believe that human beings are kind of dull and uninventive, and that all great ideas start in one place, then when you look at a map of the ancient world and see pyramids in Mexico and pyramids in Egypt and earth mounds that look like pyramids in North America, the only conclusion you can draw is, well, since they all are exactly the same, they must have a source, a single common source.
Right.
We don't have that. It must be this lost continent. And he did the same thing with agriculture. He did the same thing with metallurgy. He did the same thing with the arch, where he finds things in different parts of the world and says, wow, these are really similar. They couldn't have developed on their own. People are not inventive enough to do that. They must have diffused from somewhere. And, the place that he decided they diffused from was a mythical lost continent.
Well, and you can forgive in these people's, in Donnelly and Warren's defense, you can forgive it a little bit because we're talking about the mid to late 1800s. Again, the field itself is just starting to become a thing. We don't have a lot of information. They don't have dating methods. They've got stratigraphy at this point, but I don't think they really have much of anything else. And they certainly don't have any of the chemical and scientific ones that we use today. So, you can kind of forgive this concept of like, oh, hey, it must have all happened at once, and it must have all happened during, one great migration or several migrations, because we were kind of guessing at this point anyway.
Yeah, you know what, Sarah? You can be forgiving. I'm not going to be forgiving.
You don't have to be. I just want people to understand that there's some context to this. It's not just like a bunch of dumbasses,
Well, but as they said in what was that movie, Forrest Gump, stupid is as stupid does.
Donnelly did have a bit of criticism when he published his book, though. He and Warren.
Yes, it is true that there was no radiocarbon dating. It's true that we don't, certainly when he was writing in the late 19th century, we didn't know as much about the ancient cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia and of the Indus Valley and the Yellow River in China and of the New World and North and South America. But Donnelly knew goddamn well what crops were planted by the indigenous people in those areas, and knew that they've been doing it for a long time. And he knew damn well that the Aztecs weren't growing wheat, they were growing corn. And the Mesopotamians weren't growing corn, they were growing wheat. And so Donnelly had to ignore the fact that the Atlanteans, who are spreading agriculture all over the world, did it kind of idiosyncratically. How come they didn't give the Aztecs wheat and rice? And how come he didn't give the the ancient Chinese and the Egyptians corn and potatoes. If Donnelly had, I think, had rationally looked at the evidence, even the evidence available to him, he would have said, this is kind of wrong. And he would have. And although Donnelly, yes, knew very little about pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mesoamerica, if he looked at any of the plates of what they looked like, okay, Ignatius, they're bigger on the bottom than they are on the top. Try building something different from that. But they really don't look alike. And he knew that the Egyptian pyramids were burial chambers. He knew the Mesoamerican ones weren't. And he knew that the flat-top pyramids, the mounds of the American Midwest, well, those don't look anything at all. They're truncated pyramids. They don't look anything at all like Egypt. And yet, when you look at his maps of the spread of Atlantean culture, in America, it's the Mississippi Valley and the Missouri River and the Ohio River. All of those are colored in his map as being, oh yeah, it's the mound builders. They were from Atlantis. So, yes, we can forgive him for not having the details right, but even in the general things, he just got it. He had this fixed idea in his head that people couldn't figure out stuff on their own. So even things that are vaguely similar, they must have a common source.
I'm not going to say that he or any of his cohorts did not go into this with confirmation bias. I'm not going to say that because almost all of them, when they publish, are criticized by the establishment. There was an establishment back then, and
Sure.
they did get criticized by the establishment. So, I'm not saying that we should forgive them everything. I'm just saying it's a little bit more understanding as to why these kind of ideas would come up and spread so quickly. Because nowadays, if you were to come up with an idea like that, A, you would be shot down immediately, and B, it should be harder for that concept to travel, even though, as we can see, and we will see later with modern publishers like Von Daniken, like Menzies, like Hancock, they're still that concept still takes off and it's still very popular, but I want to say it's popular for slightly different reasons. It's still basically racism, but it's a different kind of racism.
Yeah,
So,
and I think, listen, you're wrong to forgive these guys. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
But here's the deal. I think what we're discussing though does bring up a really interesting question, and which is, why do people outside of, beyond the writers of these works of fiction that they're claiming is history, beyond us archaeologists who get up on our high horse and say, no, that's wrong. Why do people so want to embrace the notion of the mother culture, of one group of geniuses living in a privileged environment who make all the discoveries and all the inventions, and they provide it to everybody around the world? Why is that? And I'm asking this question because I don't know the answer. Why do people want to embrace that? What's so appealing about the idea that, most people are kind of dull and they need an inspiration from outside of their own culture for them to progress? Why is that more appealing to people than the notion that, everywhere people live, they have to rise to the occasion to survive, and they make discoveries on their own. They spread these out, and that's why we find ancient civilizations in Mesoamerica, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Asia, in Southern Asia, in Northern Africa, in Central Africa, in Europe. Why is it everywhere? I mean, why is an explanation that, they all borrowed it from somewhere else? Why is that embraced by people? And why do those folks want to reject the notion that, people are smart everywhere?
I think it's a mixed bag of reasons. I think the easiest answer for that is it's a cool thought. It's a cool story, and people like cool stories. That's not the only reason, and it's way too simplistic. I think some of it also has to do with people like to be special. And if you're saying that there was this grandmother culture, and this grandmother culture diffused their knowledge down to all of these poor groups of people that weren't able to do it for themselves, you're also saying that mother culture survived somehow. And if that mother culture survived then, what's to say that mother culture isn't surviving now? And we see this with the DNA talk that we've encountered a few times, because now people are starting to say, oh, well, this, especially with the Aryan thing, oh, the Aryans are the mother culture, and I have Aryan blood in me. Ergo, I am special because I am part of the mother culture. And
maybe, yeah.
I think there's other reasons too, but I mean, there's just like the plain old just conspiracy theorists who just can't believe anything real is real. But I think a lot of it has to do with they like this fun story and people really want to be special.
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever shared this little story. Years and years ago, my older son he's 30 now. Oh, he's gonna be 30 in like a couple of weeks. Anyway, but he was maybe we're looking at Josh. Josh is 6 or 7 years old, and that was a time when we didn't have a computer at home. When I needed to go on to go online, we went to school, went to my university where there were computers and the internet. And I remember I was doing some research for a book, and Josh, super smart kid, I said, look up evolution, Josh. See what you can find. And these are days when there weren't millions and millions of websites. There were like 6 or something. And so anyway, Josh used whatever the search engine was and looked up evolution. And this is a naive kid, right? He's 7 years old, or maybe he's 8, whatever. And he goes online and he says, Dad, is any of this true? And I went over, and it was a website that essentially said all of the great inventions ever made in the world, and from antiquity right to the present, were all produced by, wait for it, white people. And then it went down.
Well, yeah.
Again, Josh he's a little kid, and he's a little white kid. So he's reading, this little white kid, Josh, is reading about how special white people are because they invented everything. And we're looking at Stonehenge, at the pyramids, the Sphinx, that's a white guy, agriculture, every great invention, because they started with antiquity and they worked their way up, to, I don't know, liquid shampoo, white people. And the thing is, of course, when I looked, in fact, the banner of the site was the National White People's Aryan Party Collective. And it was, in fact, it was a neo-Nazi site.
Ah, man.
That's
you
a really
just wait.
extreme
We've got. You just wait until we get to the far end of this list, man.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that even then, right, with my kid just looking on the internet, that's that same thing that, God damn it, we are smarter than anybody else, and archaeology proves that, and we should regain our whatever the hell these crazy people are trying to regain. But that was I mean, that's the same kind of thing, that they were using archaeology, misusing archaeology, misunderstanding and misrepresenting what the archaeological record actually says, so that every archaeological site where you find cool stuff, that's white people.
Well, no, and I think it's great that your son Josh was capable. I mean, that says something about the way he was raised and the way you guys raised him, that he saw that and he questioned that right off the bat.
He didn't say, this is a lie. He just said, is this? He was perplexed. He was surprised. Is that true?
It didn't sound right to him, and that's a good thing. There are some people that read that, though, and they're like, oh, I always knew it. And it's just confirming something that they already believed, or, instead of, or maybe they're like your son and they're like, hey, Dad, is this real? And the father comes over and says, yep. I mean. Scary, huh? Well, it is. I mean, if you had told your 7-year-old son that, yes, that was true. Oh, right. Do you think he would have questioned you? Probably. No, he definitely would. Well, my Josh, he would. He questions he continues to question everything I say. No, that's fine. But now, for those listening to the podcast, understand that I know Sarah a bit. She knows me. Neither one of us are the kinds of people who see a racist under every bed, that everything is interpreted through that lens. But when you've got people saying white people invented everything, there's no other word you can use to describe what that is. That's racism. That's the appropriate use for that word. There are, we can get into lots of arguments outside of the context of this podcast about people who get all bent out of shape. But that's the first thing. You play the race. We are not playing the race card here. That card was played
by these assholes who put together these websites who say it's white people from the very beginning of time. And all we're doing is diagnosing it.
I don't think my race card gets me very far anymore, so
Yeah, there you go.
there's no point in playing it. But yeah, no, so we covered quite a bit. But as I was predicting, this is definitely going to be a multi-parter, and I hope people stick around with it because we barely made it to the 19th century and we got a lot more to go.
It was a good start, Sarah. Absolutely.
I think it is a good start, and we'll pick these up as we have time to pick them up in between all of the interviews that we have scheduled for the next couple months coming up. So Ken, thank you very much.
Absolutely, Sarah. And let's do this again sometime. All right.
Oh yes. Oh,
yeah,
yes.
you bet. Cool.
Talk to you later,
All
man.
right. Yeah, bye-bye.
Rate your trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcast